Hey, what's up, YouTube family? Good morning. It's your favorite black guy from Nebraska. And of course, it's black people in Nebraska, but you already knew that because you watched my content, so you already know. So, this is a continuation of yesterday's topic. Like I said, this chapter is pretty lengthy on the Aboriginal people of the indigenous people, of Australia. So, we're going to go ahead and finish up on the indigenous people of Australia, the Aborigines, and their history. And we're going to talk about a little bit about who came before them, because there's information about where they came from, where they migrated from into Australia. So, like everything I tell you, please research for yourself, okay? Don't take what I say as, on face value. Even me, I don't care. Even me, man, even me. So research the things that I tell you. You know what I mean? I'm giving you this information as a guiding point, as a starting point to say, you know what? I'm going to research what he just said. I'm not going to take it as truth. Even though what I bring to you, I do my best to research it for myself, because I'm not going to bring anything to you that I cannot affirm. Right. So I suggest when you hear this information, research it. You know what I mean? You may come across something else that coincides with what I'm telling you. So, hey, let's go ahead and get started, because I don't want to take too much of your time. The original people. I'm going to read you guys a quote from Hetty Perkins. "This is the land of dreamings, a land of wide horizons and secret places. The first people, our ancestors, created this country and the culture that binds us to it." That is from Hetty Perkins. Scientists have confirmed that Australian Aborigines have one of the oldest continuous population histories outside sub-Saharan Africa today. But they've also established that the Aboriginal population is not monolithic. Before the Europeans came, there were about 600 communities or tribes, each consisting of 500 to 1,000 people and speaking its own dialect. There are hundreds of unique ethnic and linguistic groups in Australia for a reason. Recent research travels there is a ton of genetic diversity in the Aboriginal population, including representatives of most of the world's haplogroups. The genetic research has also determined that the Australian Aborigines look genetically related to a diverse array of the world's oldest people, including hunter-gatherers from Nepal and the Philippines, the Great Andamanese and Ong from the Andaman Islands, the Highland people of Papua New Guinea, and certain Aboriginal people from India. This could mean that Australia was populated in several waves, or that it represents a generalized population that predated many of the human splits that occurred over the past 50,000 years. How did these waves of migrations come in? As we've noted elsewhere, it took sailing to populate Australia and New Guinea more than 50,000 years ago. Some scientists claim there were land bridges connecting everything, but plenty of areas had nothing connecting but several miles of water. As we noted earlier in this book, Australasia, or the Sunda and Sahul, was one of those areas. So yes, boats or canoes or some pretty serious rafts, but some sort of watercraft was necessary, and it couldn't have been a few small fishing boats that were simply shipwrecked after getting carried away by an unexpected trade wind or ocean current. We know that these maritime migrations were deliberate because there are computer simulations that factor in normal fertility rates and the genetic diversity of modern populations. These studies tell us that it would have required more than just a boatload or two of colonists to establish the kind of Aboriginal populations we see today. Before the Aborigines, we know that Australia, because of its location, was one of the final destinations of migrations out of Africa. And until recently, the Aboriginal people of Australia didn't have too many visitors. As a result, Australia constitutes one of the oldest continuous sites of settlement by an ancestral population of black people, as well as an outpost of the black presence across Asia. Scientists have traditionally thought that Australia was first settled by the migration that left Africa over 75,000 years ago, arriving there about 70,000 years ago. Thus, people assume that the tall Australoid Aborigines living there today are remnants of the first people in that area. But the Aborigines themselves have a rich historical tradition that, in the guise of a myth, encodes over 50,000 years of community history, including a Dreamtime state that may represent a more distant ancestral past. A critical piece of their historical recollection is the memory of an older population who settled Australia before the present-day Aborigines. The folklore of the indigenous people of northern Australia tells of fairy-like beings known as mimis. They are described as having extremely thin and elongated bodies, so thin as to be in danger of breaking in case of a high wind. To avoid this, they usually spend most of their time living in rock crevices. This is reminiscent of European, Native American, and Chinese myths about the thief in the night manner of DBP people who disappeared into the earth and are described with fanciful imagery that emphasizes their diminutive size. These mimis are said to have taught the Aborigines of Australia how to hunt, prepare kangaroo meat, and use fire. They are said to be like humans, but they live in a different dimension, perhaps Dreamtime. This reminds us of the click language Deming, which is said to have been taught by ancestral beings from Dreamtime. Could Deming have come from the original people who first inhabited Australia? You might say that they're assuming quite a lot. If all the evidence we have for the DP people or little people in Australia is Aboriginal myth, As we said elsewhere, myth is just as a European word for our version of history and science. And the older the myth, the closer it is to the truth. Fortunately, there is scientific evidence to corroborate these histories. The work of anthropologists Keith Winshuttle and Tim Gillen reveals that not only did dark-skinned, woolly-haired pygmies inhabit Australia until relatively recent times, but that the presence of these people was deliberately hidden by most early historians. The Australian DBP, or pygmies, who appear to have survived over 50,000 years, were then systematically destroyed by the colonists, like the extinct Tasmanians. The archaeological evidence suggests the original people made it to Australia quite a long time ago. In an alluvial deposit in Western Australia, Mance Lofgren and John Clark discovered more than 30 stone tools dating back to more than 100,000 years. So who pushed the world's first settlers into the margins of existence? Excuse me. Much as taller Bantu people displaced older populations across Africa, the same thing happened throughout the rest of the world. In Australia, long before the Europeans came, the ancestors of today's Aborigines displaced the people who had come before them. In his 1937 work, Environment, Race and Migration, Thomas Griffin Taylor remarks. Now, this is a quote. This is a long paragraph by a couple of paragraphs by Thomas Griffin Taylor. Perhaps we may assume a Negrito migration during an early glacial period when it was easy to get into Papua and also into Melanesia in Australia. Then the Papuan hordes moved to the south after Australia was shut off by the drownings of the Sunda region. They entered Papua at a time when we may imagine extensive deserts in northern Australia. For reasons given earlier, they drove the Tapiro into the hill jungles. Later, that first horde of Australians arrived during an ice age when the Sunda and Sahu areas were dry land. They moved down the central rivers to the southeast. They mixed with the Negritos in the south to some extent, producing the Tasmanian type. The next migration drove the Tasmanian further south and was in turn driven into the thick forest regions of New South Wales by the latest migrations. These Australians may not have been much taller than the people they displaced, but they settled in such massive numbers that they pushed their predecessors into Tasmania, the island at the southernmost tip of Australia. This may have been what began the pygmization process. Apologize. Not long after this displacement, Australia soon became heavily desertified. Considering the ecological knowledge of our earliest ancestors, I wouldn't be surprised if the original people who became Australia's pygmies had been the ones keeping Australia's ecosystem compatible with human habitation until they were removed from their land. Sound familiar? Genetic studies of surviving populations reveal that at least two distinct groups of ancient people settled Australia after the DBP, aka the Pygmies. One, a more robust type, very early in continent history. The other, a more graceful type, much later on. We'll talk about this second population in part 2. I want to read a couple other things that are in this book. There's a couple other notations in here that are called Did You Know, which is basically more information on the topic that's not inside, that's not a part of specifically the reading of the chapter. It's more of like, asterisks. Did you know the Aborigines of Australia have a 50,000-year-old oral tradition? We don't even know how much white people have stole from them, though. The Tasmanian Devil cartoon we remember from our childhood was based on an Australian Aborigine myth of the Woorah Wheelbarrow, a whirlwind with devils in it. But the Woorah Wheelbarrow also symbolized two specific regions in the spiral of the Milky Way. Also, it seems that longer the original settlers remained on the fringes, the shorter they became. The Tasmanian pygmies were no more than 4 feet 6 inches tall when anthropologists came to examine them in the 1800s. And once the Europeans arrived, it wasn't long before the Tasmanian, who were virtually cornered, became extinct. All right, I believe that is the end of this 2-part series of the Aboriginal Australians. Okay, so I hope you guys really enjoyed that information. Like I said, the chapters that I read from are out of a book called When the World Was Black, The Untold History of the World's First Civilizations, Part 1, Prehistoric Culture. And there is more about the Aborigines of Australia in Part 2. I have both parts. So if you guys really enjoyed this, let me know in the comment section, and I can go ahead and go into Part 2, and I can go ahead and make some more content, read you guys some more information out of Part 2, okay? Hey, it's your favorite black guy from Nebraska. Yes, it's black people in Nebraska. Hope you guys have a wonderful, blessed day. I'm out. Peace.